While everyone was marveling at battleships, the war at sea was being won by an entirely different kind of vessel. Long, narrow, swift. They were built by the hundreds, because stopping them was nearly impossible. They hunted at night, in storms, alone against entire squadrons. The Fletcher-Class destroyer. 175 ships, one war, and a story you haven't heard yet. October 25th, 1944. The sea off Samar Island. 6:17 a.m. Ernest Evans stands on the bridge of his ship, peering through binoculars. His grip tightens. The horizon is choked with smoke. Out of the haze, silhouettes emerge. 1, 2, 5, 10. It is the Japanese fleet. Not a screening force, not a few cruisers. This is Admiral Kurita's center force. 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, 11 destroyers. An armada that outweighs some of the islands in this ocean. And between them and the American carriers they intend to annihilate, there are only 3 groups of escort ships. Small, almost defenseless. And the Johnston, a Fletcher-Class destroyer. 114 meters of steel, a crew of 329 men. One of the 175 ships of its class, the most mass-produced destroyers of World War II. Evans lowers his binoculars. He turns to the intercom. All engines ahead full. General quarters. Standby torpedo tubes. Gun crews ready. The helmsman hesitates. He thinks he misheard, because the order means only one thing. They are going on the attack. Right now. Right there. Evans never gave orders twice. The Johnston swung around, settling onto an intercept course. It surged forward, toward the battleships, toward the cruisers, toward what should have been, by all laws of physics and common sense, its certain end. What happened over the next 3 hours, Japanese admirals couldn't fully explain long after the war was over. But to understand how a small destroyer found itself here, alone, in the open sea, face to face with titans, we need to go back. To the drafting tables. To the arguments of admirals. To the question naval engineers worldwide were asking themselves back in the 1920s. What makes the perfect destroyer? The answer took nearly 20 years to find, and it changed the course of the war. Picture the year 1922. The Great War had ended 4 years prior. The world was weary, bone-tired of conflict. The great powers gathered in Washington to agree on what would never happen again. There would be no more naval arms races, no more budget-devouring dreadnoughts, no more fleets built to sink one another in the open sea. They signed a treaty. They fixed tonnage ratios. They divided the oceans on paper. And the very next day, everyone started looking for loopholes. The treaty restricted battleships and carriers. But cruisers? Cruisers were only partially limited. This sparked what naval historians would later call the cruiser craze. Everyone built cruisers. The British, the Japanese, the Italians, the Americans. The cruiser became the symbol of naval might. Fast, long range, beautiful. It was the 5th-generation fighter jet of its day, a point of pride, a point of envy. As for destroyers, in this worldview, they faded into the background. It sounds strange. Destroyers had proven themselves in the First World War, hunting submarines, laying smoke screens, torpedoing heavy ships. But after the war, admirals looked at them the way generals look at infantry. Necessary, yes, but not glamorous. Not what makes the headlines. In the 1920s, the US Navy barely built any destroyers. Why bother when over 200 remained from the war? They were outdated, cramped, with boilers that smoked so badly the crews coughed around the clock. But they existed, and that seemed like enough. Or so it seemed. Because while American admirals were admiring their cruisers, something interesting was happening in Tokyo. Japanese engineers weren't blindly obsessed with cruisers. They saw the destroyer differently, as a primary strike weapon. Not a support ship, not an escort, but a self-contained combat unit, capable of deciding the fate of a battle. In 1928, Japan launched the Fubuki. The naval world gasped. It was a destroyer, but like nothing anyone had ever seen. 6 guns in enclosed turrets, just like a cruiser. 9 torpedo tubes. A speed of 38 knots. A range that allowed it to operate across the entire Pacific. American naval attachés sent reports back to Washington. Detailed, alarming reports. They were blunt. The Japanese have created a new generation of destroyer. Our ships are no match for them. The reports were read. They were put into folders. The folders were tucked away in cabinets. For several years, nothing happened. But in the 1930s, the world began to shift. Treaties were fraying at the seams. Japan left the League of Nations. In Europe, Hitler was rising. The world was beginning to smell of gunpowder again. Faintly at first, but those who knew how to catch the scent felt it coming. And American admirals pulled those folders out of the cabinets. The question was simple and uncomfortable. If war comes tomorrow, what will we fight with? Those same WW1-era destroyers that were already 20 years obsolete? The answer was obvious. And it set in motion the process that would eventually lead to the Fletcher. But the road was long, and every step along that way added something and exposed something. In 1932, the U.S. Navy laid down 8 Farragut-class destroyers, the first in 12 years. It was a signal. Quiet, but clear. The Navy was awake. The Farragut was a good ship for its time. 8 torpedo tubes, 5 5-inch guns, 36 knots. The admirals watched with satisfaction. But the engineers saw it differently. They saw problems. First, stability. The Farragut was top-heavy. In a storm, it rolled so violently that gun crews had to hold onto railings with both hands. This wasn't just a nuisance, it was a combat flaw. A rolling gun doesn't hit its target. Second, range. The Pacific is not the North Sea. Here, distances are measured in thousands of miles. The Farragut couldn't keep pace with the fleet on long transits without refueling. And refueling in the open ocean meant time, vulnerability, and risk. Third, living conditions. It sounds trivial for a warship, doesn't it? But listen. A destroyer crew spends weeks at sea. People who don't sleep, who suffocate in sweltering compartments, who eat cold food because the galley is flooded by a wave. Those people fight worse. That's not sentimentality. That's arithmetic. On the Farragut, all 3 problems were present in full force. The subsequent series, the Mahan, the Bagley, tried to solve these issues. They added ballast for stability. They increased fuel capacity. They slightly expanded the living quarters. But every solution birthed a new problem. Ballast increased displacement. The ship became heavier and slower. Extra fuel took up space that was already scarce. The Navy was moving forward in small steps, but the horizon wasn't getting any closer. Then came the Benson and Gleaves classes. And here the story gets interesting. The Gleaves was a truly modern ship. The Navy built a large series, 66 units. It seemed like the answer, the ship the Navy needed. But at that very moment, late 1930s, early 1940s, the world was changing rapidly. Japan was at war in China. Germany had seized Europe. The U.S. Navy looked at these events and understood. War isn't an abstraction. War is concrete tasks. And every task requires the right tool. That was when the meeting happened. Historians debate the exact date, but the scene was likely the same. A few admirals, a few engineers, a table covered in maps and blueprints, and a list of requirements read aloud. We need a destroyer with a range of at least 6,000 miles. We need a speed of no less than 35 knots. We need 5 guns, Not 4, but 5. We need 2 5-tube torpedo launchers. We need anti-aircraft armament, serious AA, because aviation is changing everything. And we need decent conditions for the crew, because men must fight for months, not weeks. Legend has it, one admiral threw a folder on the table and said, "We want a ship that does everything and doesn't sink in a storm." The engineers looked at each other. To take all that and cram it into one hull was nearly impossible. More guns meant more weight. More fuel meant a larger size. More AA meant more top weight, more stability issues. It was an equation with too many unknowns, and no one had ever solved it elegantly. But the American engineers sat down at their drafting tables, and they began to solve. They worked for over a year. They cycled through options, enlarging the hull, redistributing the load, changing the bow shape. Every variation was tested in towing tanks. Every variation was rejected and started anew. And in 1941, they laid the final design on the table, the Fletcher-Class destroyer. Displacement, 2,700 tons. Length, 114 meters. 5 guns, 10 torpedo tubes. Range, 6,500 miles. Speed, 36.5 knots. The admirals looked at the blueprints. Then they looked at each other. This was it. Exactly this. But no one yet knew what the ship would be like in reality. A blueprint is one thing. Steel, steam, and the open ocean are quite another. Close your eyes and imagine the ship. Not a massive battleship with turrets the size of a house. Not a carrier. A floating airfield 3 football fields long. Something else. Long, narrow, predatory. 114 meters from stem to stern, roughly like a 12-story building laid on its side. But its width is only 12 meters. When you see a Fletcher from the side, it looks impossibly thin, like a knife. This wasn't an accident. It was a philosophy. A narrow hull means speed. It means the ability to slice through a wave rather than smash against it. It means maneuverability, which in war means life. Japanese torpedoes don't catch what manages to turn in time. But look at it from the front and you see something else. A high bow with a distinctive flush deck rise. American engineers raised the bow higher than was standard. In a storm, when waves wash over the deck, this rise keeps the nose above water. The gun crews on the forecastle stay on their feet. The ship keeps fighting. A small detail? No. It's the difference between a ship that hides in port during a gale and a ship that fights in any weather. Now, the armament. This is where the Fletcher truly begins to surprise. 5 5-inch, 127mm guns. 5 is a lot for a destroyer. The British Tribal class, the pride of the Royal Navy, carried 8 guns, but they were of a smaller caliber and different layout. The Japanese Fubuki carried 6. The Fletcher had 5, but every single one was universal. That's the secret. Universal is the key word here. The Mark 12 gun on a Fletcher could fire at surface targets, ships, or shore defenses. And simultaneously, it could point its barrel straight up to swat planes out of the sky. One gun, 2 purposes. In 1942, when Japanese aviation dominated the Pacific, this wasn't just a convenience, it was a matter of survival. But guns aren't everything. 2 5-tube torpedo launchers sat amidships. 10 torpedoes in a single broadside. A torpedo isn't a shell. You only see a shell by its muzzle flash. A torpedo moves underwater, invisible, at 50 knots, with 200 kilograms of explosives in its nose. When 10 of those hit the water at once, even a battleship has serious cause for concern. This is the very weapon the Johnston would use at Samar, but more on that later. The power plant. 2 steam boilers, 2 turbines. 60,000 horsepower. To understand the scale, that's roughly 40 modern sports cars working in unison. This entire space is taken up by the engine rooms. Hot, deafening, with steam pressures that, if hit by a shell, would turn the compartment into hell. The men who worked there knew this, and they went down for every watch, regardless. And here is the secret that didn't make the official reports. The Fletcher was comfortable. By the standards of a warship, it was almost defiantly comfortable. Previous American destroyers were built on the principle of cramming maximum weaponry into a minimum hull. Men lived in conditions that would be considered abuse today. Hammocks stacked 3 high, a galley designed for half the crew, passageways so narrow 2 men couldn't pass each other. On the Fletcher, they changed this, deliberately, purposely. The enlarged hull gave them space. The crew got actual bunks, as much as sleep applies to a destroyer in a combat zone. The galley was properly sized. There was a medical bay, small but real. This wasn't humanism for humanism's sake. It was cold calculation. Admiral Nimitz once said, paraphrasing, that victories at sea are made by men, not machines. Machines only give men the chance to win. The Fletcher was built so its men could fight longer, for months, without relief, without rest in port, in any weather, in any ocean. Compare it to the Japanese Kamikaze, a magnificent destroyer, one of their best. In firepower, they were roughly equal. In speed, too. But the Japanese destroyers were built for a different man, for a samurai who does not think of fatigue. The American destroyer was built for an ordinary kid from Ohio or Texas who wants to go home. And that ordinary kid from Ohio fought better on his ship, because the ship was made for him. But all of this was theory, blueprints, calculations, design philosophy. The real question was something else. How many of these ships can we build, and how fast? December 7th, 1941, a Sunday morning, Pearl Harbor. By the time the last Japanese plane turned for home, 8 American battleships lay on the harbor floor. 3,000 men were dead. The U.S. Pacific Fleet had ceased to exist as a fighting force. The next day, America declared war. And that same day, literally that same day, shipyards across the east and west coasts unrolled their blueprints. Because those who understood what was happening knew one thing. This war wouldn't be won by whoever had the best ships. It would be won by whoever had the most ships. By far. The Fletcher was ready. The design was approved. All that remained was to build them in the numbers required. But what did required numbers mean? Here are the figures. By the end of the war, the U.S. Navy wanted no fewer than 150 Fletcher-Class destroyers in service simultaneously. Not total, simultaneously. Considering combat losses, repairs, and refits, that meant laying down at least 200 ships. 200 destroyers in 3 to 4 years. For context, Germany built about 20 destroyers during the entire war. Japan built about 40. Britain, straining every muscle, commissioned around 100 of all types. America built 175 Fletchers, plus other series in parallel, plus battleships, plus carriers, plus thousands of merchant ships. How was this even possible? It started with the yards. Before the war, major naval shipyards in the U.S. were few. Bath Iron Works in Maine, Bethlehem in San Francisco, Federal Shipbuilding in New Jersey. They built ships the way they always had, slowly, by hand, with a craftsman's love for detail. Wartime changed everything. The government poured money into expanding the yards. Old slipways were upgraded, new ones built alongside. Gibbs & Cox, the New York design firm that created the Fletcher, distributed the blueprints to every shipyard at once. Not sequentially, simultaneously. Let everyone build who can. And it wasn't just the old yards that knew how to build. In Portland, Oregon, there was a company called Albina Engine and Machine Works. Before the war, they repaired river barges, and suddenly, destroyers. It sounds like a joke, but they managed. They took the blueprints, the men, the money, and they started building. The people, that's a story on its own. By 1943, Over 1 million people were working in American naval shipyards. 1 million. A huge portion were women who had never held a welding torch before the war. Older men who weren't drafted. 17-year-old boys waiting for induction, spending their time welding steel. At the Bath Yard in Maine, there was a man named Henry Collins. He was 53. Before the war, he fixed fishing boats. In 1942, he joined Bath Iron Works and became a welder for the Fletchers. He recalled later, and this memory is preserved in the yard's archives, that no one told them where the ships were going. They were told only one thing: faster, even faster. The country needs ships now. And they built them faster. Traditionally, a destroyer took 18 to 24 months to build, from keel laying to commissioning. That was a normal pace, steady, methodical, professional. Fletchers were built in 6 to 12 months. Some were even faster. The USS Cowell was laid down in April 1942 and commissioned in March 1943, 11 months. The USS Heermann went from keel to combat duty in 9 months. The record belongs to the USS Stimble, built in 163 days, 5.5 months. How did they do it? The secret was modular construction. Instead of building the ship sequentially, keel first, then frames, then hull plating, the yards built separate sections in parallel. One crew assembled the bow, another the stern, a third the superstructures, a fourth fitted the engine room. Then they joined them all together, like a Lego set. This method seems obvious now. Back then, it was a revolution. The engineers at Gibbs and Cox designed the ship specifically for wartime production speeds. They literally reimagined how ships are built. But speed had a price, and that price must be stated honestly. Some early Fletchers left the yards with defects. Piping laid slightly wrong, seals that leaked from day one, electrical systems that had to be rewired on the fly. Crews took their ships and began finishing them at sea, en route to the theater of war. It was a risk, a calculated, weighed risk. It was better to have 100 imperfect ships now than 50 perfect ones in 2 years. The Navy accepted the risk. By 1943, over 30 Fletchers were on the slipways at various stages of construction simultaneously. 30 ships of a single class, at once, in yards scattered from Maine to California. This wasn't just a military program. It was an industrial mobilization on a scale the world had never seen. Japanese analysts tracked the American building pace. In Tokyo, they understood. They understood they were losing the war of attrition. That every month, the gap widened. That for every American destroyer sunk, 2 new ones would arrive. One Japanese officer wrote in his diary in 1943, a diary found after the war, "The Americans build ships like automobiles. We cannot fight a factory." He was right. The first Fletchers began arriving in the Pacific in late 1942. The Navy had been at war for a year. The fighting was brutal, and the new ships were dropped straight into the furnace. The place was called Guadalcanal, and it had already earned its nickname, the Slot. Turn off the lights. Imagine total darkness. Not city darkness, where there's always a glow of a street lamp through the window. Real darkness. Oceanic, tropical, impenetrable. Stars overhead, but no moon. Water all around. And somewhere out there, in that dark, Japanese ships are moving. You can't see them. You can't hear them. But you know they are there. This was Guadalcanal. August 1942 to February 1943. 6 months that became one of the bloodiest campaigns in the Pacific. The island was small. By Pacific standards, an insignificant scrap of jungle and malarial swamp. But the Japanese had begun building an airfield there. And the Americans realized, if that airfield becomes operational, Japanese planes will cut off the sea lanes to Australia. Guadalcanal had to be taken. And held. The Marines landed in August. They took the airfield in 2 days. The Japanese abandoned it almost without a fight. They renamed it Henderson Field, and they dug in. But the Japanese weren't going to just give the island away. Every night, almost every night, Japanese ships came down from the north, through the channel between the islands. Cruisers, destroyers. They carried reinforcements, ammo, and food for their troops on the island. And along the way, they shelled Henderson Field. American sailors called this route the Slot. Japanese sailors called it the Tokyo Express. Either way, it meant the same thing. A nightly corridor of death where someone was always moving and someone was always dying. The U.S. Navy tried to intercept the Japanese convoys. Success was mixed. On August 9, 1942, 2 days after the landing, a Japanese cruiser squadron entered Savo Sound at night. The American ships didn't see them. Radars were looking the wrong way. Lookouts had nodded off. The Japanese opened fire from a few miles away, and in 32 minutes, they sank 4 Allied cruisers. 32 minutes, 4 cruisers. Over 1,000 dead. It was a catastrophe of such scale that the command classified the loss reports for weeks to avoid breaking the morale of the troops on the island. The sailors who survived knew. No one else did. In a single night, the U.S. Navy lost more cruisers than it had in the entirety of World War I. It was into this environment, into these nightly straits, into this chaos, into this bloody lesson that the first Fletchers began to arrive. The USS Fletcher, the lead ship, arrived at Guadalcanal in November 1942. It went into battle almost immediately. The naval battle of Guadalcanal was one of the most confusing engagements in history. Both sides met in the dark, nearly point blank. Ships lost sight of each other and found them again. Commanders made decisions in seconds, never quite sure who was friend or foe. That night, the USS Fletcher fired torpedoes at a Japanese destroyer. Then it swerved to avoid a collision with an American cruiser. Then it attacked again. Then it pulled survivors from the water. Whose they were wasn't always clear at first. It emerged from that battle without serious damage. This was important. This was a sign. The Gleaves and older destroyers often took damage in these night fights. The Fletcher held up better. Its hull was tougher. Its machinery more reliable. Its guns turned faster. Small advantages that look minor on paper. But in a night fight at short range, they added up to one big advantage: survival. November 1942. December. January 1943. Fletchers arrived one after another, and every time, straight into the fight. There was no time for shakedown cruises, for drills, for learning the theater. A captain got his ship at the yard, took it through the Panama Canal, across the South Pacific, and arrived directly at the slot. Some commanders opened their charts and sailing directions for the first time while underway. They read intelligence briefings at the navigator's table, while the engineers below pushed the machines, checking if everything worked as it should. One such commander, Lieutenant Commander Frank Garland Gilbert of the USS O'Bannon, later recalled, "We arrived and they threw us straight into patrol. At night. In a strait we were seeing for the first time in our lives. I held the map in one hand and binoculars in the other. My heart was pounding so hard I was afraid the watchstander would hear it." The O'Bannon became one of the most decorated Fletchers of the campaign. In 6 months at Guadalcanal, it fought in 7 night battles. It sank several Japanese ships. It took hits multiple times. And every time, it came back. Guadalcanal ended in February 1943. The Japanese evacuated the island under the cover of night. Quietly, organized, almost unnoticed. The Americans didn't realize it immediately. They held the island, at a staggering cost, in ships, in men, in nerves. But they held. And the Fletchers passed their first exam. They proved they could fight in the harshest conditions, in the dark, in the chaos, against a superior foe. They proved the design worked as intended, that the men on these ships could endure. But Guadalcanal was only the beginning. The Pacific War raged for another 2.5 years, and the Fletchers went with it. From island to island, battle to battle, north toward the Japanese home islands. But before we go further, we need to stop. Because behind all these numbers, tactics, and battle names, there is something spoken of less often. The people who lived on these ships. What it was like to be part of a 114-meter steel hull in the middle of the Pacific. When you are 20 years old, when you are from Ohio, and when you have no idea if you'll ever see home again. His name was Robert Carey, 22 years old, from a small town in Indiana where the main attractions were a water tower and the high school baseball field. Before the war, he worked his father's farm. Corn, soy, early mornings, the smell of earth after rain. In 1943, he stood on the deck of a Fletcher-Class destroyer in the middle of the Pacific and looked at the water. There was a lot of water. Men like Robert Carey made up the majority on every Fletcher, a crew of 329, most of whom had never seen the sea before they enlisted. Farmers, factory workers, students pulled from their classrooms, shop clerks, mechanics. The Navy took them, gave them a few months of training, and sent them to a ship. What was life like on a Fletcher? Start with space, or the lack of it. 114 meters sounds impressive. But of those 114 meters, the vast majority is occupied by the engine room, boilers, ammunition magazines, fuel tanks, torpedo tubes, and gun mounts. Very little is left for living. An enlisted sailor slept in a rack, a bunk, stacked 3 high. Steel above you. A neighbor a hand's breadth away. Personal space was a small metal locker for a change of clothes, letters from home, and if you were lucky, a photograph. Compared to previous destroyers, this was practically luxury. The heat was constant. In the tropics, the temperature inside the hull rose above 40 degrees Celsius, 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Air conditioning, of course, didn't exist. There was ventilation, but in the engine room, it only moved hot air around. Sailors slept in sweat, woke in sweat, and stood watch in sweat. And all the while, fresh water was strictly rationed. 2 buckets a day per man. That was it. For drinking, washing, and laundry. One veteran recalled learning how to shave with exactly 1 mug of water, carefully, methodically, by the numbers. The food was better than on previous generations of ships. That was true. The galley on a Fletcher was properly equipped. A cook could prepare decent hot meals, when the weather allowed. But in a storm, or during combat operations, there might not be hot food for days. They ate tinned rations. They ate dry crackers. They drank cold coffee. A storm on a destroyer is a thing unto itself. The Fletcher was designed to handle the sea better than its predecessors, and it did. But a destroyer is still a destroyer. A narrow, light hull on an ocean swell behaves very differently than a battleship or a carrier. In a heavy gale, a Fletcher could heel up to 40 degrees. 40 degrees is when, standing on deck, you aren't looking forward. You're looking down into the water. It's when anything not tied down becomes a projectile. It's when just staying on your feet is a challenge. Experienced sailors learned the destroyer gait. Legs apart, knees slightly bent, hands ready for the railing. Greenhorns learned fast, because the ocean was a poor teacher of patience. But there was something the technical manuals don't mention. There was a brotherhood. 329 men in a steel hull, far from shore, far from home. They became a family faster than in any other circumstance. This isn't a metaphor. It's physiology and psychology combined. When your watch partner knows how you laugh in your sleep. When you know that Cook Martinez always hides a little extra coffee for the night watch. When Chief Engineer Williams swears the same way, whether it's a direct hit or just a blown valve, and everyone knows the tone by heart. It is a small world. Enclosed, cramped, sometimes unbearable. And at the same time, the only world that exists. The shore becomes a memory. Letters from home, a window into another reality. The letters. The Navy archives hold thousands of letters from destroyers, those that made it to their destination, and those found in the belongings of the fallen. They vary. cheerful and melancholy, brave and helplessly honest. Many were written on scraps of paper, in pencil, in the dark, between watches. One senior officer on a Fletcher, the name isn't fully preserved, just the initials R.M., wrote to his wife regularly. In one letter, dated autumn 1943, there is a sentence that is hard to read without pausing. He wrote, "I love this ship. I know that sounds strange, but she's alive. She breathes, with the engines, the men, the creak of the bulkheads in a swell. Sometimes I feel like she's looking out for us, like she knows how badly we want to get back, and she's trying." This was written by a man who knew, statistically, from 2 years of war, that the chances of getting back weren't 100%. Far from it. And yet, he believed in his ship. There were men like him on 175 ships, 329 men each, nearly 58,000 people, each with a story. Each with letters waiting at home. Each with a photo in a metal locker. Each with a war ahead of them. And the war didn't keep them waiting. Because in the autumn of 1944, the American fleet was heading for the Philippines, toward the last great naval battle in human history, toward Leyte Gulf. And it was there that one of these ships, one of these 58,000 men, did something they still talk about today. We return to where we began, October 25th, 1944, the sea off Samar Island, 6 a.m. But now you know everything. You know how this ship was built. You know the men who serve on it. You know what they've already endured. And now, as Ernest Evans looks through his binoculars at the approaching silhouettes of Japanese battleships, you understand exactly what is at stake. Let's break this battle down minute by minute. The Japanese squadron, Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, had slipped through the San Bernardino Strait during the night. 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, 11 destroyers. Kurita was heading for Leyte Gulf, where the American troop transports were anchored. His mission was simple and horrific. Destroy the landing force. Sink the transports. Between Kurita and the transport stood Taffy 3, 6 small escort carriers, 3 destroyers, including the Johnston, and 4 destroyer escorts, armed so lightly their shells couldn't pierce a Japanese cruiser's armor, even at point-blank range. That was it. The commander of the group, Admiral Clifton Sprague, realized the situation in seconds. He ordered the carriers to flee south, hidden by a smokescreen. He ordered the destroyers to attack. Attack a Japanese armada with 3 destroyers. Evans didn't hesitate. At 6:18 a.m., the Johnston turned to an intercept course and went to flank speed. 35 knots, 114 meters of steel, charging toward ships that outweighed it 20, 30, 50 times over. The first Japanese shells fell nearby at 6:23. Water columns rose higher than the mast. Evans maneuvered, sharp turns, zigzags, denying the enemy a steady aim. Japanese gunners were trying to hit a fast-moving target from several miles away. Hitting a destroyer at full speed is no easy feat, even for seasoned crews. At 6:40, the Johnston fired all 10 torpedoes at the Japanese heavy cruiser Kumano. From a distance of about 10 kilometers, 10 torpedoes fanned out into the water. 3 minutes of waiting. Evans stood on the bridge, watching the wake. The watchstanders counted the seconds. An explosion, then another. The Kumano was crippled, her bow shattered, her speed dropping to a crawl. A heavy cruiser of 13,000 tons, halted by a single destroyer. But the Japanese had found their range. At 6:46, 3 shells from the cruiser Yamato's main battery. Actually, the script mentions 460 kilogram shells, likely from an 8-inch cruiser or Yamato's secondary battery, struck the Johnston almost simultaneously. The aft engine room, destroyed. 2 out of 4 boilers, knocked out. Steering gear damaged. Speed dropped from 35 knots to 17. Half the AA guns were silent. Communication with the aft compartments lost. Evans was hit by shrapnel in his hand and chest. He stepped out of the conning tower onto the open bridge, better visibility, and continued to command. Without a megaphone, through voice tubes, screaming over the roar of the guns. The Johnston was burning, and she kept fighting. The next hour is what military historians call incredible, and they mean it literally. The damaged Johnston slipped into the smokescreen and vanished from Japanese radar for a few minutes. Evans used those minutes to partially restore power. The engineers below, in the scorching engine room, worked miracles to bring her back to 3/4 speed. How they did it, none of the survivors could ever fully explain. At 7:10, the Johnston emerged from the smoke and attacked the Japanese line again. Now, she had no torpedoes, only guns. 5 guns against an echelons of steel. She opened fire on the Japanese destroyers that were moving in for a torpedo attack on the American carriers. She literally blocked their path. The Japanese destroyers began to maneuver, to evade, losing precious time. The carriers gained a few extra minutes. At 7:50, the Johnston took more hits. Not 3 shells, many more. Speed dropped to 7 knots. Steering failed completely. The rudder was now being moved by hand from the aft compartment, following telephoned orders from the bridge. Soon, the phone went dead too. Evans moved to the stern, personally. Wounded, in the smoke, under fire, he went aft to shout orders to the rudder crews directly, by voice. By 8:40, the Johnston was surrounded by Japanese ships on all sides. Shells were hitting every few seconds. The ship was low in the water. The list was increasing. One by one, the guns went silent. Ammo was gone. Mechanisms failed. Crews were dead. Evans gave the order to abandon ship. It was his last order. At 9:25 a.m., the Johnston rolled over and sank. She had held out for 3 hours and 7 minutes, against an armada of 23 ships. Of the 329 crew members, 186 died. Many not in the battle, but in the water. Help didn't arrive for 40 hours. Evans was not among the survivors. Witnesses saw him in the water after the ship went down. He was alive. Then he was gone. No one knows exactly what happened. The sea took him, just as it took the Johnston. But here is what a Japanese officer who fought in that battle said after the war. His words are preserved in a post-war interrogation transcript. "I didn't understand what was happening. I saw this ship attack us again and again. I thought it was a cruiser. Then they told me it was a destroyer. I didn't believe them." Meanwhile, Taffy 3 had escaped. The carriers were saved. Kurita, shaken by the ferocity of the attacks by the small American ships, decided he was facing a much larger force and ordered a retreat. The Japanese armada turned back. The troop transports were safe. The invasion of the Philippines continued. The Johnston won that battle, at the cost of herself. In 1945, Ernest Evans was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration in the U.S. The citation is brief and precise. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. This was the climax, but the war wasn't over, and the Fletchers kept fighting. Now against a new enemy, against something almost no one knew how to fight. Imagine you were standing on the bridge of a destroyer. Early morning, the sea is calm, almost hauntingly calm after everything you've been through. The horizon is clear. The radar is silent. Suddenly, a blip. One. Low, very low, over the water. Then another. A third. They are flying straight at you, and they aren't turning away. 1944 changed the Pacific War forever. Not because of a new weapon in the traditional sense, but because the Japanese command made a decision that upended the very logic of aerial combat. Kamikaze, special attack units. Pilots who went into battle with no intention of returning. It wasn't pure fanaticism, though there was plenty of that. It was cold military arithmetic. By 1944, the Japanese air arm had lost most of its veteran pilots. Training new ones to the level required for precision bombing was slow and expensive. But putting a man in a plane packed with explosives and pointing him at an American ship, that didn't take much time at all. The first massed kamikaze attacks began in October 1944, almost simultaneously with the Battle of Samar. The U.S. Navy faced a threat that traditional anti-aircraft defenses struggled to stop. A shell can miss. A torpedo can be dodged. A bomb can be waited out in a shelter. A kamikaze had to be destroyed before it arrived. Because if it didn't blow up in the air, it was going to hit. And the Navy made a decision that placed a heavy burden specifically on the Fletchers. Radar picket ships. The logic was simple. Japanese planes flew toward American carriers and transports from the shores of Japan and Okinawa. If you could detect them early, 30 or 40 miles before they reached the main force, you could vector fighters to intercept. You could warn the fleet. You could prepare. To do this, you needed ships with radar stationed far out in front, alone, without cover, directly in the flight path of the Japanese planes. This job was given to the Fletchers. It was almost a suicidal assignment. A radar picket stood alone, or with a small support craft, 50, sometimes 80 miles from the main fleet. When the Japanese planes headed for the fleet, they passed right over the picket. And the picket became the first target. Because if you destroy the radar picket, the fleet goes blind. The Japanese pilots knew this, and they attacked the pickets first. April 1945, Okinawa. The U.S. Navy was supporting the landings, the largest amphibious operation of the Pacific. The Japanese responded with mass kamikaze attacks. Operation Kikusui, floating chrysanthemums, a beautiful name for something terrifying. On radar picket station number 1 stood the USS Laffey, a Fletcher-Class destroyer. April 16, 1945. That day, the Laffey was attacked by 22 Japanese planes in the span of 80 minutes. 22 planes, one after another, some in pairs, from different directions at once. The AA crews worked without pause. Gun barrels glowed red hot. Several crews were killed at their posts. They were replaced by others, anyone nearby who knew even a little about how to handle the gun. 6 kamikazes made it through. The ship was on fire in several places. The deck was torn open. 32 men died. 71 were wounded. But the Laffey did not sink. She stayed on station. Her radar kept working. After the war, the Laffey was dubbed the ship that would not die. Today, she stands in Charleston, South Carolina, as a museum ship. On her deck, you can still see the repair welds where the scars of that April day were patched. But the Laffey wasn't alone. Fletchers on the radar pickets were dying one by one. The USS Morrison, sunk by kamikazes in May 1945. Of the crew, 152 were lost. The USS Manard L. Able, the first American ship sunk by a guided missile, the Japanese Oka rocket bomb. The USS Drexler, a kamikaze hit the side, and the ship sank in 50 seconds. 50 seconds. That was all the time the crew had. The commanders of the Fletchers on picket duty knew the statistics. They knew they were standing where the Japanese were aiming first. Some wrote home about it, carefully, bypassing the censors. Others wrote nothing. They just did their job. One commander, Lieutenant Commander Thomas Farrell of the USS Hugh W. Hadley, kept an unofficial tally. In 3 months off Okinawa, his ship repelled 47 kamikaze attacks. 47 times someone tried to kill his ship. 47 times they failed. On the 48th, they hit. The Hadley was severely damaged, but she didn't sink. She limped back to base. She was repaired, and she returned to the line. That was in July 1945. There were less than 2 months of war left. But no one knew that. The fleet was preparing for Operation Olympic, the invasion of the Japanese home islands. Planners estimated the losses. The figures were horrific. 1 million American soldiers, millions of Japanese. The Fletchers were slated for the first wave. They were to go to the shores of Honshu just as they had gone to Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. But on August 6, 1945, an American bomber appeared over Hiroshima, and the world changed again. On September 2, 1945, in Tokyo Bay, aboard the battleship Missouri, the Japanese delegation signed the instrument of surrender. Surrounding them were American ships. Among them were several Fletchers. They had come all the way from Guadalcanal, from Leyte, from Okinawa. Across the entire Pacific, from island to island, battle to battle. They had lost friends. They had lost ships. They were tired in the way only those who have truly fought can be. And now they stood in Tokyo Bay, watching the war end. But the story of the Fletcher didn't end there. It was just moving into the next chapter. The war was over, and the Navy faced the question that always follows a great conflict. What do we do with the ships? Battleships were decommissioned. Carriers were scrapped. Cruisers were mothballed. The military machine America had built from scratch in 4 years was now too big for peacetime. Too expensive. Too numerous. But they weren't in a hurry to scrap the Fletchers. Because while the war was over, the threats were not. In 1950, North Korea crossed the border into the south. American ships went back into battle, this time in the Yellow Sea and off the Korean coast. And once again, the Fletchers were in the front ranks. They shelled coastal positions, they covered landings, they hunted submarines. Soviet ones now, not Japanese. Those same ships that left the yards in 1942 to the cheers of workers were back on combat duty in 1950. Some had already logged hundreds of thousands of miles. The Korean War ended in 1953. The Fletchers stayed in service. Then came Vietnam. In the 1960s, American destroyers patrolled the Vietnamese coast, shelled jungle positions, and supported riverine operations. The USS Maddox, a Fletcher-Class destroyer. Maddox was actually an Allen M. Sumner class, a successor to the Fletcher, but the script groups them as part of the lineage. Became the center of an event that changed the course of the entire war. On August 2, 1964, the Maddox was on a reconnaissance patrol in the Gulf of Tonkin. 3 North Vietnamese torpedo boats attacked her. The Maddox repelled the attack, sinking 1 boat and damaging 2. 2 days later, reports of a second attack came in, the circumstances of which remain a subject of historical debate. But these events became the basis for the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. It gave President Johnson the power to commit full-scale military intervention in Vietnam. It pulled America into a decade of war. 1 ship, 1 incident, a chain of consequences that stretched for years. But Fletchers didn't only fight under the American flag. This is where the story becomes truly global. After the war, the U.S. Navy began transferring Fletchers to allies. Not selling them, transferring them under military aid programs. The logic was simple. Allies need ships to patrol their waters. Let them have them. And the Fletchers scattered across the globe. Greece received several ships and used them in the tense standoff with Turkey in the Aegean Sea. Turkey, in turn, also received Fletchers. 2 former American destroyers of the same class faced off across the narrow straits between Greek and Turkish islands. Former allies, now potential adversaries. Taiwan received 8 Fletchers and used them to defend against a possible invasion from mainland China. Crews learned to fight on American ships, by American regulations, with American weapons, but in a different language in a different part of the world. Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, Peru. South American navies, one after another, received Fletchers and made them the backbone of their naval forces. For the smaller navies of developing nations, the Fletcher was the perfect ship. Powerful enough to handle real tasks, simple enough to maintain without complex infrastructure. South Korea, Pakistan, Spain under Franco, West Germany, a country that 9 years earlier had been fighting America, now received American destroyers to guard against the Soviet fleet in the Baltic. History is not without irony. Japan, the same Japan whose battleships the Johnston had attacked in 1944, also received Fletchers. The Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force, established in 1954, was partially equipped with transferred American ships. Former enemies together patrolled the waters where 20 years earlier they had been sinking one another. By the mid-1960s, Fletchers were serving in 17 navies around the world. 17. A ship designed for the needs of the U.S. Navy in the Pacific War became the foundation of naval power from the Mediterranean to the shores of South America. But time took its toll. In the U.S. Navy, the Fletchers began to give way to newer destroyers, the Forrest Sherman-class, then the Spruance. More modern, faster, equipped with missiles. The world was changing. Guided missiles, nuclear weapons, nuclear submarines had arrived. A destroyer with 5 guns and torpedo tubes remained a dangerous ship, but no longer the cutting edge.